Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm K.M. Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There is no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Season 17, Episode 11. And today's episode is sponsored by Damonza.com. As one of the leading names in book cover design right now, they have designed most of my book covers, and they are currently offering free book cover reviews. So whether you're about to publish or you're just curious to know how your cover stacks up, this review is a no-brainer. This will give you a fresh, informed perspective that offers crucial insight into how your book cover performs in today's competitive market. So don't miss this chance to make your book unforgettable. It's totally free, and all you have to do is visit damonza.com/review/WBA to get started. That's damonza.com/review/WBA. And now, welcome to this week's episode, The Most Dangerous Arc, breaking down the corruption character arc. In storytelling, few arcs are as gripping or chilling as the corruption arc. In this arc, characters don't just fall, they choose to fall. Although, of course, they don't generally think of it like that. Whether driven by fear, pride, or desire, they trade their integrity for a lie, believing it will give them what they want. And even when this is true, the cost is an ever-deepening descent into self-delusion and often self-righteousness. In today's breakdown, we'll explore how to craft this final entry, and in many ways most insidiously dangerous, in the triad of foundational negative change arcs. If you're writing a story about a character who chooses the wrong path and justifies it every step of the way, this post will offer insights into creating a devastating corruption arc. So throughout this month, we've been looking under the hood of the three foundational negative change arcs. We've already explored the disillusionment arc and how it bridges the positive change and negative change arcs by forcing characters through a revelation of the thematic truth that is so powerful, it is uncertain whether they will embrace it in a way that is ultimately redemptive, or it will succumb to the bitterness and resistance that can lead to ever-deepening negative spirals. We've also explored the fall arc, in which characters refuse to take that journey into the truth at all, instead doubling down on mistaken perceptions in a way that requires an initial lie to be bolstered many times over with further lies, leading the character to a much more benighted state than that of the beginning. And today, we culminate with the corruption arc, which presents the mirror opposite of the positive change arc. So in a positive change arc, characters will evolve their perceptions of themselves and the world from a limited lie to a more expanded truth. Oppositely, in a corruption arc, the character will begin in a relatively privileged and enlightened perspective, only to compromise this position through a failure in vigilance against the always present possibility of self-delusion. From there, they may well spiral ever deeper into the darkness. So let's start by looking at the corruption arc at a glance. In this arc, the character sees the truth, rejects the truth, and embraces a lie. At the hook, the character understands a truth. The protagonist lives in a normal world that allows for or even encourages the thematic truth. As a result, the protagonist starts out with an understanding of the truth. At the inciting event, we see the first temptation of the lie. The call to adventure, when the protagonist first encounters the main conflict, also brings the first subtle temptation that the lie might be able to serve the protagonist better than the truth. At the first plot point, the protagonist enters a beguiling adventure world represented by the lie. So the protagonist is faced with a consequential choice and enticement out of the first act's safe, truth-based normal world into the second act's beguiling, lie-based adventure world. Not realizing the danger, the protagonist is lured through the door of no return by the promise of the thing they want. At the first pinch point, the character will be torn between the truth and the lie. The protagonist is torn between the old truth and the new lie. The lie proves itself effective in moving the character nearer the want. But the character wages an internal conflict in moving further away from old convictions and understandings of the world. At the midpoint, or second plot point, the character embraces the lie without fully rejecting the truth. So the protagonist encounters a moment of truth and faces the lie in all its power. The character recognizes that the thing they want cannot be gained without the lie. Although not yet willing to fully and consciously reject the truth, the character makes a decision here to fully embrace the lie. At the second pinch point, the character resists a sacrifice that is demanded by the truth. So the protagonist is, quote unquote, being rewarded for using the lie. Building upon what was learned at the midpoint, the protagonist will start implementing lie-based actions in combating the antagonistic force and reaching toward the want. The truth pulls on the character, demanding sacrifices too great to give. The character begins resisting the truth more and more adamantly from this point on. At the third plot point, the character will fully embrace the lie. The protagonist utterly rejects the truth and embraces the lie. The character acts upon this in a way that creates a low moment for the world and for the protagonist morally, if not practically. So the character is now willing to knowingly endure the consequences of rejecting the truth in exchange for the rewards of embracing the lie. At the climax, we see the character in a final push to gain the thing they want. The protagonist enters the final confrontation with the antagonistic force to decide whether or not they will gain the thing they want. Unhampered by the truth, the character pushes forward ruthlessly toward the plot goal. And at the climactic moment, we find complete moral failure. The protagonist uses the lie in an attempt to gain the thing they want, and they may gain the thing they want and remain senseless to the evil engendered by these actions. Or the character may gain the want only to be devastated that it wasn't worth what was sacrificed. Or the character may fail to gain the want and be devastated by the realization that the sacrifices to the lie were fruitless. One way or another, the character definitively ends the conflict with the antagonistic force. And in the resolution, we encounter the aftermath. The protagonist must confront the aftermath of all their choices. They may turn away from the lie, admitting mistakes and accepting consequences, or the character may callously forge ahead, intent on continuing to use the lie to further self-serving ends. So, as we know by now, all character arcs start with a lie the character believes. And this is a mistaken or limited perception of reality. The lie could be simply a lack of information, such as how to overthrow the bad guy. Or it could be an outright delusion. For example, I am the smartest person in every room. It could be a perspective held about oneself that is either incorrectly positive or incorrectly negative. For example, I am a kind person when you're not, or I am worthless. It could be an over or underestimation of others. For example, hero worship of a flawed leader or demeaning put-downs of certain people. Or it could be an expectation of how the world works. For example, the deck is stacked against me, or I deserve to have the rules bent for me. Whatever the case, the challenge to this lie catalyzes the beginning of every type of character arc, except the corruption arc. Instead, the corruption arc begins when a character is somehow tempted toward a more constrictive perspective. So on the surface, of course, this doesn't make sense. Why would anyone who consciously holds a relatively expanded perspective be foolish enough to willingly step into a more limited way of being? The answer is as old as time and in many ways boils down to a lie of its own. The characters believe they can use the lie for their own purposes without allowing it to corrupt them. Hubris is always a factor. Now, sometimes hubris may be the main factor in that characters feel so secure in their currently positive worldview that they believe they can risk a temporary step back into the shadows. Other times, the primary motivator may be high stakes that cause characters to feel they are without choices. They understand they are not choosing an option that aligns with their integrity, but they choose anyway because they, quote unquote, have to. And because, again, with a measure of hubris, they believe they can flirt with this seeming shortcut and still return with their integrity intact. These characters make the fundamental mistake of believing that because they see some truth, they are capable of seeing all of it. They believe they are capable of shining a light through the darkness they willingly choose to navigate in search of a treasure they need. For example, Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars believes the lie that power can prevent loss, leading him to embrace control as a moral justification. He also tends to conflate power with wisdom, overestimating his ability to wield power well. So this is what makes the corruption arc one of the most complex character arcs. And why is that? Because daring the darkness in search of a healing treasure is also the heart of the heroic positive change arc, in which characters risk everything, including integrity and perspective, to seek a better way of being. In essence, this is what corruption arc protagonists also do, or at least this is what they tell themselves they're doing. The difference is that when the character is presented with the choice between desire and truth, that is, between power and integrity, the corruption arc character's ability to recognize or honor the latter will increasingly fail. The polarity of humility and hubris are present in both positive change and corruption arcs. Traditionally, positive change arc characters, particularly hero archetypes, start out with a certain measure of hubris, which is a form of the lie, which they must exchange for humility as they progress down the path. While corruption arc characters also begin with at least a hidden measure of hubris, they will end, in at least the abstract, in downfall and humiliation. For example, Macbeth believes his destiny entitles him to power, which allows him to rationalize betrayal and murder. Ultimately, what the corruption arc shows us is the high cost of failing to hold our previous successes, whether material or spiritual, with the type of humility that safeguards our gains against our own capacity for delusion and regression. Just as the disillusionment arc can be recognized as an abbreviated positive change arc, stopping short before it is clear whether the character will be able to integrate a harsh truth into a greater good, the fall arc, which we discussed last week, can also be recognized as an abbreviated corruption arc. So in this case, the fall arc represents the latter part of the corruption arc, after characters have adopted the lie and now must work double time to bolster that lie with even more lies. So you'll remember that the fall arc shows a character who refuses to accept the challenge of the truth, and from there devolves into a much worse lie, all in an effort to protect that initial lie, which could have been quite a small lie to begin with. Now, the corruption arc begins before this point, revealing a character who likely has more mental or moral capacity for recognizing comparative lies and truths. This is a character who has achieved some level of personal integrity, which has now brought them to a place of testing. And the central question is whether they will compromise their understanding of their own personal truth, aka their integrity, in exchange for a measure of power. For example, Walter White in Breaking Bad begins manipulating, lying, and killing as he clings to power, convincing himself it's for his family when really it's about ego. So what always makes this invitation to power tempting is that it is essentially a shortcut. Whatever the practical mechanics of the plot, we know this is a shortcut on a character level because it prompts the character to take the easy route in defiance of a deeper sense of personal right and wrong. At some level, the corruption arc character will always know this, and in more nuanced stories will often be shown to struggle with it. In short, they make an informed choice. They are not ignorant about what they are choosing. They understand it is against their deepest self, and they understand the possibility of untoward consequences to themselves, or more likely to others. They do it anyway. And from there, the character's journey will begin to mirror the fall arc. In order to protect this one out of integrity choice, characters begin justifying their actions with an ever-deepening slide into delusion. From believing they had no choice or no one would get hurt, they will begin to adopt perspectives that insist they were in the right, or even they were acting in everyone's best interest, or they knew better than the ignorant masses. For example, Gollum in The Lord of the Rings slowly abandons his identity and humanity, letting the ring reshape his very soul for the sake of possessing it. The tragedy of the corruption arc is its excruciatingly slow slide away from wholeness into delusion. Corruption arc characters very often end by achieving their goals. Thanks to the devil's deal, in which they sell their souls, they may well gain tremendous power and influence within their personal spheres. In the end, some characters may retain enough sense of their personal truth to wake up to the horrors they have wrought in their own lives and others, in which case the victory for which they have sacrificed so much will prove horrifyingly empty. And in other stories, characters will end by fully embracing their new lie-based identity. Not only will they become the monster they initially believed they could resist, they may even fully condone what they have become. For example, Michael Corleone in The Godfather exemplifies a corruption arc character who justifies his increasingly immoral actions by convincing himself they are necessary for protecting his family. Eventually, he becomes fully immersed in the darkness he once resisted, and by the end, Michael's self-delusion is so complete he not only believes his choices are justified, he also pulls others into his moral decay, perpetuating the destruction of those around him. Those corruption arcs that do not end with the characters achieving a redemptive sense of humiliation at what they have become will instead end with the character in a state of grotesque self-righteousness. They will justify their choices by any means necessary, no matter the consequences heaped upon others. Like the fall arc, the corruption arc character's self-delusion in the end may be so complete and compelling that it also warps the perception of others, pulling them down into the darkness as well. For example, by the time we meet President Snow in the Hunger Games, he is wholly consumed by the belief that fear is the only way to ensure social stability. He's convinced himself that this lie is not only necessary, but noble. He enforces it with ruthless propaganda, manipulation, and death. He's not just corrupted himself, he's built an entire system on his delusion. The corruption arc reminds us that character arcs are not just about change, but about choice. Of all the negative change arcs, the corruption arc may be the most haunting. It doesn't happen to the character, it happens because of the character. And the central danger isn't ignorance or even resistance to the truth, it's the conscious decision to turn away from it. When well written, these arcs offer some of the most compelling, nuanced, and tragically human stories. As writers, exploring this arc challenges us not just to understand the psychology of our characters, but also to confront the darker possibilities within ourselves. Now that brings us to the end of today's episode, but if you're intrigued by the emotional and thematic power of the corruption arc, or any of the negative change arcs, or any of the arcs at all for that matter, you'll find even more in-depth guidance in my book, Creating Character Arcs. It walks you step by step through how to craft compelling transformations, positive, flat, and negative, and how to seamlessly weave them into your plot. So whether your characters are resisting change or spiraling toward it, The tools inside this book will help you bring their arcs to life. It's available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook, along with its companion guide, the Creating Character Arcs Workbook. And now I hope you'll stop by the site and tell me your opinion. Have you ever written a corruption arc or considered one for your protagonist or your antagonist? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.